Make sure you have a good, oh, whoops. First thing.
Hi guys, and in this video I'm going to show you how I do my mastering. So, I do mastering in two ways now. I use iZotope Ozone, and I also use not Ozone. So I used stock plugins, third-party VSTs, and just cobble everything together to try and create a master chain. And I'm going to split this video into two parts, where part one is showing you how to master with Ozone, and part two is showing you how to use not Ozone, so everything else. So the hardcore way, old school. Anyway, I'm assuming you know what mastering is, what it really is, so I'm just going to continue from there with that knowledge in mind. The first part you have to ensure you've done is get a good mix down. Without that, your mastering won't work properly. I'm not going to teach that here, but you can go look that up somewhere else. The basic idea, well, I don't know if this is right, but this is what I do. I get all the perceived volumes of the track around the same first, and then I adjust from there. So if I need something to be a little bit louder, I'll make it a bit louder, something a bit quieter, I'll do that. And I always ensure to maintain at least -8 decibels of headroom so that nothing peaks when it comes to the master. So we're going to turn this into this, just with Ozone. These are some extras that I add, and that are probably not a very good way of doing it now, but I will show you what these do afterwards, after we finish with Ozone. So the first thing I'm going to do is delete Ozone and put on a new instance, so that I'm not, so that I can actually show you how I do it. Okay, the first part I start with is the dynamic multiband compression, or it's called dynamics in Ozone 5. And I just work from the left to the right, compressing all the bands like that. So what I do to compress is usually set the ratio to something like 4 or something, 2 to 4 usually. I just default to 4 because it's easy. Then I play the track at a position where the average loudness is going to be at its loudest. So for me, this is the drop of this track. Let's see. So I can see it's peaking around about here and staying there on average. So I just lowered the threshold to about where that was. So let's play that back, and I adjust the threshold to be just below that point, so that the in-between region is, you'll understand what I mean. So it doesn't go below that very often, and that's the idea. You just want to keep the bass compressed and make it tight. One thing I do a lot is A/B the track. So I solo the band that I'm using, and I A/B the track using the bypass button to see how my changes are sounding. Now, as you might be able to hear if you're wearing headphones or if you have big subwoofer, is the compressed version is slightly quieter, which is going to happen. Audio is going to be removed when you through the thing if you're not using makeup compression. I use the auto gain button, which tries to automatically make up the volume of the compressed audio to the same level that the uncompressed audio was. The algorithm's not perfect, but it does the job fairly well. Sometimes you might need to adjust the gain slider manually, and you can work that out by using bypass and listening to the volume. Yeah, you can see auto gain's done a fairly good job there. You don't really have to worry about the limiter, but I like to set that to a value to make sure nothing's going to actually clip if some weird thing happens. The value is really arbitrary. You don't really need to worry about it. Just make sure it doesn't go past the loudest point of your track, and make sure it also doesn't go too far up here or it won't do anything. So with that in mind, let's move on to the other bands. I don't exactly have a set formula for picking. I just say heavy compression here, light compression here, heavier compression here, and almost as heavy as the bass in this band. So let's go solo this one, and Round about there. The compression is most obvious in the mid-range, so try not to overdo it here. That's why I have my ratio set to a fairly low level so it doesn't reduce the gain too much. Anyway, mid-high band. So set that somewhere like, I don't know, 2.9, 2.8, high-ish. Sounds pretty good. Now let's go into the highs, or the trebles. Alright, pretty sure the dynamics is done now, so if I A-B that on and off, this is without dynamic. You can see when I switched it on in the second half, it made a subtle difference. It might not be that noticeable now, but it really makes a difference when we make up the volume with Maximizer. So the second thing I do is go on to the stereo imaging part where I adjust the stereo field of the song. In theory, you don't really have to do this at all if you do it in the mixdown properly, but you know, I really like the way Ozone does this by actually boosting the bands instead of actually creating stereo data by adding a small delay on one of the channels or phasing them. So it's more of a stereo enhancer rather than an imager. Just a hint, Ableton's EQ8 also can do this with the new mid-side method in Live 9. So if you want to do that and you don't really have Ozone, you can use Live 9's EQ, and I'll show you how to do that in the second part of the video. Anyway, I usually don't touch the stereo image on the sub-bass section, anything below 120 Hz, because most subwoofers aren't going to be stereo, and especially in clubs, if you have stereo sub-bass, you're going to have a bad time. So I usually either completely make it mono or leave it. And often when I make it completely mono, by removing all stereo data, it sounds weird and I don't like it, so I just leave it at 0%. I'm not going to adjust the bass here, but I will start with the trebles. Now, I solo the trebles, and this is just totally by ear, I guess. You can do this as much as you want, although I recommend you not to overdo it. That sounds good enough, so 50% there. Like 32-ish there. Oh, that didn't work well. Alright. Now the mids. Now try not to boost the stereo of the mids too much. Most of the stereo data, well, it's going to be most obvious in the mids, just like compression. So try to use it sparingly. I usually don't go over 15% here, or 20%, but yeah, you can set it to what your ear likes. Yeah, it sounds good. Okay, now to preview that, use the power button here. I will show you without and then with. You can just see it adds a little bit more stereo wideness to the whole track. Next thing I do is use the Harmonic Exciter, which is I use the tape saturation mode, but there is also lots of other modes here. Some other favorites of mine are retro and tube. Mainly I use retro and tape. Tape gives more of a brighter, tapey, hot-driven sound that mastering engineers used to use back in the day. And the retro gives more of a warmer, just overall gentler style of saturation. I suppose you should use this when you're looking for bright commercial tracks, and use this when you're looking for just more gentler mastering, like in pop songs where you use acoustic instruments, for example, or you could use the warm mode. Just experiment with all the modes and pick the one that sounds best to you. Now I'm going to use tape saturation for the purpose of this one, and I can show you how much of a difference it makes. Now you might be able to hear when I A-beat it there with the bypass, it made quite a big difference. So basically, I kind of did forget to tell you what this does. This isn't just an EQ or a compressor or anything. It's actually type of distortion, multiband distortion almost, except it's not quite distortion. It's different. But what it does in general is takes input and then synthesizes new harmonics based on that input. And these algorithms decide which harmonic pattern to synthesize. So it's trying to emulate tape saturation in this mode. You might want to Google how tape saturation works. It's a very analog thing. It's very hard to emulate in the digital world, but I think Ozone does a pretty good job. Anyway, on to the new bands. And low, mids. Okay, now I'll turn it off and show you. There we go. It makes it slightly louder already and just in general more clear. Although it does tend to raise the mids a little more than I'd like, but that's okay. We fixed that in the EQ section. Okay, now trick with the post equalizer. There's two tricks I like to do. First is go into the options and activate soft saturation, so that even if you boost something to the point where it would drive it into digital overdrive, the EQ itself actually employs more of a soft clipping algorithm and doesn't let it peak, just like a saturator or something else that would just not let it go over zero. And the second trick I like to do is open the graph using this button here, and I move the EQ to before the loudness maximizer here, so that everything gets compressed by the last thing here. You can also swap the order of any of these around as you'd like. Experiment with this. If you have a preferred order of doing things, put that here. Okay, bands. I always have high pass at 20 Hertz. I use the brick wall, so it surgically cuts off anything below 20 Hertz. And I have a low pass at 20,000, again with the brick wall low pass, cuts off surgically everything above 20,000 Hertz. It helps to keep your MP3 files smaller, because you won't have data that's not doing anything. Some people would argue that you are cutting out data that you can hear, and to some extent they're right, but for most people, I'm not going to hear the difference between 20 Hertz and 19 Hertz, and anything below that, or 20,000 Hertz and above. On a final master, anyway. So I pretty much then activate all the bands, and I always have 7 as a shelf, so I can raise all the trebles at once, just like that. It's easier for me. Okay, let's get into it. Start by, I guess EQing really is all subjective. You can do whatever you want here, but I tend to boost the bass, either scoop or boost the mids a tiny little bit, and boost the trebles slightly, and you'll just see my general workout for EQing. Alright, there you go, my EQing's done. As you can see, it's not very impressive. I don't really do much here, but it's, you know, it makes a small difference that most people probably don't care about, but I do, so yeah. Now, the part where the loudness comes up is the maximizer. This place really is, it's a brick wall limiter, but not really. It's got different algorithms, and these all do different things based on what you want them to do. As a general rule, the more you go up here to 1, 2, and 3, the higher quality it is, and also the higher latency. I think this one adds like 3 seconds of latency or something. Well, it used to on my old computer. This one might not so much, but still. I really don't hear much of a difference between them. Mastering engineers are probably face palming right now, but that's okay. I just use IRC1 because it adds almost no latency. I don't worry about intersample detection. I have a message. I'll ignore that for now. But yeah, this basically limits the... In the analog world, you're going to have bits in between, because digital sampling works... say you have 44,100 samples in a second, but in the real world there's actually infinity number of samples in a second, so the spaces in between can sometimes peak above the digital peaks. So this turns on... It turns on more of a prediction algorithm to minimize the intersample analog peaking. Some people, what they do is they have the margin set to 0.3 or something, so that's the maximum loudness that track will ever reach, so that this is to compensate for that intersample peaking. But I don't worry about that because because I turned this on, and that usually does a good enough job. And the small amount of clipping that does happen in the analog world is not really going to be that noticeable unless you turn it up to 1,000,000% and you kill everyone's ears. So, with that in mind, I keep the character at 4. It seems to suit basically everything I do. I might turn on the transient recovery algorithm and raise it to 100%. If I'm working with something very transient and dynamic that I want to preserve. But for most times, I just keep it off because it adds a ton of latency. Stereo linking is also interesting because it enables you to compress each left and right channel individually, and this thing manages that by itself. But I usually turn it off because it doesn't really make a difference that I can hear in most of my tracks. It might for yours, so keep that in mind and use it if you want to. Anyway, here's the fun part. Really, I just push this down a lot and try to get the RMS value to a fairly high level, say -4 to -3. You go any higher than that and you're going to have a bad time. But again, if dynamic range is your aim, then try not to go as high as I do. My aim is to kill everyone with loudness war. So, peak and RMS. Let's see. How can I explain this? Let's go full Khan Academy, and So peak value at a track, say we pause the track and examine the volume level, like freeze the meters and examine the volume level. So at peak, writing with a mouse is a lot harder than it looks. Peak is equal to volume at any given time, which will use X. And the peak will be different for each time that you choose to freeze the meter and examine the volume. So this is a very exact, precise way of determining volume, but humans don't really work like that. So in order to make up for this, they invented the root mean square algorithm, or RMS. So, oh, that looks terrible. RMS is actually equal to a bunch of volumes, so we'll call them V1 plus squared, sorry, you have to square the volume, plus V2, square that, plus V3, square this, and it keeps going on until Vn squared, which is determined by how long your program chooses to listen, which is usually a couple of seconds, maybe less, like half a second. The value doesn't really matter. But anyway, these values are all square rooted. So if you don't know a lot about math, that's okay. Basically, the idea is they're just taking an average volume. How can I explain this another way? So if you have a waveform that's like this, and it peaks, if you were to sample the entire volume using the peak method, this would be quite a loud track. But the human ear is using RMS method is the closest way of representing it. So that would mean that the ear is more sensitive to the area under the curve than the actual amplitude of the peaks itself, meaning that RMS curve is something like this. This is quiet in RMS terms, but loud would be, so yeah, this is very loud. So this is, there we go. This is quiet in RMS, this is loud in RMS. Now that the math's out of the way, let's get to it. RMS values are displayed at the top part of the VU meter, and, oh no, sorry, that's peak output is displayed at the top, and RMS is the one underneath it. So let's go. And there we go. If you go too far, like I did when I went down to 10 or 11, you can hear that it crushes my snare, and that's getting rid of too much dynamic range, so I put it back to there. You can see the RMS was sitting at around 6 to 7, or 5 to 7. That's fairly good. I've seen some people like Skrillex and Zomboy crush their things to -1 RMS, which is insane. That's almost distorting. But it sounds pretty good, so they must be doing something different to me that works a lot better. Anyway, that's basically done. Your track is now mastered, and if I A/B that on and off, I'll show you what that sounds like. This is with it off. And this is on. There we go. And these extra tricks here that I have is soft clipping. Mastering engineers sometimes use soft clipping to increase the overall loudness without really adding lots of compression artifacts or distortion. And I used to use the saturator in Ableton with the soft clip algorithm engaged, and this was not a very efficient way of doing it because it would often add distortion. And then I used to make up the volume that was slightly lost with this brick wall limiter from FabFilter, which is very good, and you'd hope so because it's not cheap either. Anyway, I haven't actually done anything with it here, but so that's even more compression. And sometimes you want that, sometimes you don't. It might be too loud for your taste, and that's fine, you just don't do it. Anyway, I found a new way of, proper way of doing soft clipping is to actually use a VST dedicated to it. So I have started using G-Clip, which is also free. You can just Google G-Clip and you'll be taken to this website where you can download it for free. So I turn off this, and you'll see what the soft clipping does. Really, it just denies access to any of these peaks going over a certain level. And there you go. Now the clip is not, these peaks are being just soft like it's not brick wall cutting them off and distorting them like hard clipping is. It's a type of soft clipping. It's a different algorithm, and you can read about that elsewhere. This also makes you lose some volume, so that's why I use the compressor and make that up. There we go. As you can see, it's a flat line there, and that's what the soft clipper is doing. It's just crushing everything below that line. So now that we've crushed it enough, there we go. That is mastering in Ozone and some other VSTs if you want to add that extra.